Chapter 2. Father and Son. Saint-Domingue, 1762. March 1762 dawned relentlessly hot over the coffee plantations of Jérémie Saint-Domingue. The lush fields were shrouded in the merciless humidity of the Caribbean. Within the sun-drenched confines of a modest plantation home, the air was dense with anticipation and anxiety as Marie Suzette David de la Pailletterie labored through the agonizing throes of childbirth. Sweat trickled down her ebony skin, her nails digging into the worn four-poster bed as her piercing screams cut through the suffocating heat. Framing her were two exhausted-looking enslaved women cradling her through the pain. The once luxurious velvet sheets that typically adorned the master's bed had been hastily discarded, replaced by simple linen now stained with blood and perspiration. "I can't do it. It hurts. I can't, the poor woman begged. "Remember, that what has once been done may be done again. Rose is living proof that you can do this," the older woman croaked in a low, resonant voice. Her name was Nuit, and she was the older of the two women helping their poor pregnant mistress. Though born with the name Naïma, years of slights regarding her admittedly odd complexion and her distinctive voice had left her with a moniker that was far inferior to the woman's true qualities. Therefore, she had become known as Nuit, a shortened version of the French word for frog. The other woman could not have looked further from Nuit's unprepossessing appearance. Manon was tall, beautiful, and skinny. She turned heads even among the whites of Saint-Domingue wherever she went. If the master ever allowed her hair out of her scarf, there was likely not a man on either side of the island, French or Spanish, who could have resisted her beauty. In the hall outside paced the anxious father, Antoine David de la Pailletterie, a disgraced marquis with old family ties to France. Antoine and Marie Suzette had been married in a secret ceremony attended by only the village priest 6 years before. He was much older than his wife, but that was not their only difference. Saint-Domingue was an island full of couples from many different backgrounds whose social statuses were defined by their casta. It was a convoluted system where a person's value was determined by how far removed their ancestors were from the mother country of France, or Spain for those in the East. Antoine, being French-born, noble, and white, was at the top of the social hierarchy. His wife, on the other hand, had been born enslaved, which would have normally put her at the very bottom of the pyramid. But thanks to matrimony, she now enjoyed the privileges of her husband's status. Saint-Domingue had many shades of landowners lately, and many couples, married or otherwise, looked just like Marie Suzette and Antoine did. White and black, but fully assimilated to colonial expectations in their dress and mannerisms. It was a deeply integrated island, despite its harsh treatments of those in the lower castas. Every individual, from the highest to the lowest degree, had his place in the ladder of social life, and around him swirled a little world of interests, composed of stormy passions and conflicting atoms. As if their social status was not confusing enough, what was even more of a riddle was the nature of their feelings for each other. Though speculation abounded, few people in the town of Jérémie truly knew if their marriage was based on Antoine's love or lust for his wife. What was even more ambiguous, however, was the question of how she felt about him. Marie Suzette was an enigma, a stoic Scheherazade of the southern coast. Under normal circumstances, Marie Suzette was the picture of grace and elegance. She dressed in perfect French fashion, displaying to the world that, despite her dark complexion, she was absolutely the mistress of their plantation. But today, decorum was the furthest thing from her mind, as each excruciating contraction brought out her most unrefined behaviors. Marie Suzette felt much closer to her African ancestors today as her body, despite its present agony, pulsated one with nature. The pain felt like it was never going to stop, though Nui frustratingly insisted that this particular contraction had only lasted 53 seconds. After what was assuredly an eternity, Marie Sosette finally experienced a moment of peace. Her body was shaking and sweating, but the pain had abated momentarily to a dull ache. Through the door, Antoine called, "Why is it so quiet? Is everything all right? Is he here?" Nui called to a young girl in the corner of the room who had been tacitly and uncomfortably playing with a couple straw dolls while holding her ears to stifle the sound of her mother's screams. "Marie-Rose," Nui snapped. "Go fetch more water and tell the master that his howling won't make the babe come any sooner." Little Rose knew Nui was serious when she used her full name. The 6-year-old shivered a little as her mother shot her a sharp look across the room. Without a single word, Rose knew exactly what her mother was cautioning her about. Rose was absolutely forbidden to repeat Nui's words to the man outside, at least not verbatim. She must always remember to show deference. But the moment shared between mother and daughter was suddenly cut short with another rising contraction. Rose was eager to leave the stifling room. The little girl had been warned that childbirth would be frightening to witness. Marie Sosette had tried to preempt her for months about the blood and screaming. However, hearing her mother shrieking in pain was far more terrifying than the poor child had anticipated. She nodded her head succinctly to her writhing mother, then hastily ran out of the room. As she closed the door behind her, she came face to face with her stepfather. He looked angry, though perhaps his nervousness had contorted his face unfairly. He was not an easy man to read, even on a normal day, of which this certainly wasn't. His face always looked strangely tight, with permanently furrowed eyebrows. Antoine stared at the little girl expectantly, but Rose did not know what to say. She was confused between Nui's orders and her mother's intense look of caution, so instead she simply stared back in silence. It was not the encounter her stepfather desired, so he broke the silence, yelling impatiently, "What news? Is he coming?" "I don't know, Uncle Sir. I think so. Miss Nui said the baby is coming, but I didn't see it yet," she stammered nervously. "Then why are you here?" he barked irritably. "To get water?" she whimpered, looking respectfully towards the floor as she rocked onto her ankles uneasily. Her voice held a hint of a question, as if she was uncertain if her answer would meet his approval. "Then go!" he screamed. Panic and worry were flashing across his face. She nodded quickly and ran off to the well outside. Antoine picked up a book to calm himself. The Principles of Political Right by Rousseau. It was one of the books he had used to teach his wife how to read. He grinned softly. Some of their most intimate moments had happened while they were reading. There was something about the way she smiled when she figured out a difficult word that captivated him entirely. She was so beautiful. He almost got lost in his memories, but another scream from behind the door snapped him back to his present anxiety. He ran his fingers across the spine of the book to try and calm himself. It was well worn, and he could barely make out the words anymore. His small library included only a handful of books, some of which he kept hidden in his study due to their provocative nature or enlightened liberalism. He did not want Marie Sosette to get too many progressive ideas, though he had a suspicion that she'd been reading them secretly nonetheless. Generally, they read the Bible, but works by Rousseau and Voltaire offered riveting diversions when the weight of the holy texts felt too burdensome. The Baron, who had enslaved Marie Sosette, like most planters in Saint-Domingue, forbade literacy from those he held captive. However, since securing her freedom, Antoine had found himself increasingly in need of a wife who could help as a business partner, and that was impossible without teaching her to read. Plus, her passion to learn was infectious. Marie Sosette approached literacy with remarkable determination. She had picked up the words and letters with incredible speed. On some level, it frustrated Antoine that she was so naturally astute. It almost didn't seem fair that she could learn with an alacrity and conviction that surpassed his own. Thankfully, societal constraints would allow the academic disparity of skill to remain hidden outside of the confines of their home. As intriguing as critiques of the limits of monarchical power could be on an average day, today Rousseau's famous text was not providing the distraction Antoine yearned for. He clapped the book closed in frustration. A small cloud of dust emanated from the worn pages as the book snapped together. He couldn't handle the stress anymore. When her first child had been born, he just left for a couple days on business and allowed her the peace of his absence. But this was his child, so he was obliged to stay and wait. He wasn't prepared to hear her in such pain. It felt ungodly, the noises she was making. It scared him. He tried to reopen the book, but as soon as he did, the paper offensively sliced the skin of his finger. The book had to go. He threw it furiously across the room. As it flew, the corner narrowly grazed a glass oil lamp that was sitting on a table. For a moment, Antoine held his breath optimistically as the lamp teetered on the edge of the polished wood, the oil vacillating inside. But ultimately, gravity was a more powerful force than wishful thinking. The lamp shattered on the floor, sending fragments all across the room. "Manon!" Antoine yelled with frustration. A few long seconds passed, but to his great aggravation, the door to the bedroom remained firmly closed. Her languid pace caused Antoine to repeat more emphatically, "Manon, come here!" Immediately, the door to the bedroom opened and Manon stepped out. She looked deeply irritated to be called out before him, when she clearly had much more important things to do. She looked absolutely exhausted, like she had aged a decade in a single afternoon. Manon wasn't a woman to cross. Antoine knew that, no matter her station. Despite her incredible beauty, Antoine had only been able to purchase Manon at the slave market because she had been surprisingly affordable, despite being in her prime childbearing years. The woman had been through 5 masters in the last 4 years. She would get pregnant with each new master, and time after time, the baby died mysteriously in her belly. People said she was cursed or evil. Either way, she was extremely unpopular with the wives of plantation owners. Antoine didn't trust her around Marie Sosette, but his wife had insisted she help through this trial. Manon looked Antoine dead in the eyes, unblinking, as she wiped her bloodied hands on her apron, as Marie Sosette was panting at a staccato soprano behind the door, which Manon had left slightly ajar. She curtsied stiffly. "Yes, master?" she asked, with a tone that gave Antoine pause. "Clean this up," he said as firmly as he could, indicating the broken lamp on the floor. But his voice wavered slightly. He was already regretting calling for her. "Master?" "Your wife," she replied slowly, her voice frustrated. "I am aware of her condition, but my son cannot be born into a filthy house," he shot back sharply. Another piercing scream cut through the air, its timbre rising like the high-pitched wail of a tea kettle under boil. Manon glared at him and brought him back to heel. Antoine's spine shivered. If he angered this woman too much, who knew what she would do? "Does she need anything?" Antoine asked, his tone softening, hoping it would direct the woman's ire elsewhere. Plus, he genuinely hated hearing his wife in pain. "She needs me back in there, master," Manon said shortly. Antoine grunted. "Go," he muttered, and waved her back into the bedroom. As she closed the door behind her, he bent down begrudgingly to handle the mess himself. It couldn't be that difficult. The floor was smeared with thick, glistening oil seeping from the shards of glass. He looked around for something to soak up the spillage, but there was nothing nearby. He grabbed a small handkerchief from his pocket and tried to wipe it up. The oil soaked through the silken fabric immediately, leaving a disgusting, greasy feeling on his skin. This was degrading. He shouldn't have to do this. Changing his mind, Antoine snatched a nearby pillow from a chair and placed it over the mess. Done. He stared back down at his accomplishment. It looked ridiculous. With a final, exasperated groan, Antoine stormed outside to check on the coffee store and the progress of the harvest, just as little Rose ran back inside with a bucket of water. Inside the bedroom, Marie Cosette was struggling to breathe. The air was so humid and heavy, it felt like it was pressing down against her chest with every laborious breath. "You can do it, honey." "One more big push," Nui encouraged. With enormous effort, Marie Cosette summoned the last threads of her remaining strength and forced everything she had to get the baby out. Suddenly, the room was filled with a sweet melodic cry, breaking through the tension like a burst of sunlight. "A perfect little boy, madame," Manon smiled. "Is he healthy?" Marie Cosette panted. "He's perfect," Nui said. "Clean him up, Manon." "I'm sorry, honey, you aren't quite done yet. We need to get through the afterbirth." As Nui supported the weary Marie Cosette, Manon gently wiped down the baby, her movements swift and practiced. She carefully swaddled the newborn in a soft blanket, and as soon as Nui allowed it, she placed the infant tenderly into Marie Cosette's eager arms, curtsying deeply as she did. Despite their matching skin color, Manon had always treated Marie Cosette with the reverence expected of the master's wife. Now this tiny boy whimpering in his mother's arms added another complicated level to the household hierarchy. The child bore the telltale hue of his mixed heritage, marking him as mulatto in the rigid hierarchy of Saint-Domingue's casta system. He was noble, like his disgraced father, but also burdened by society's views of his mother's blackness and past status. Nui, on the other hand, had known Marie Cosette for many years, and had always regarded the mistress more like a daughter. Marie Cosette's own mother had passed away years earlier, back on the plantation of the Baron de Vastet, so she was grateful for the presence of the older matron. "You did it, love," Nui said affectionately, gently nudging Marie Cosette's shoulder and cooing at the little boy in her arms. She turned to the anxious 6-year-old who had popped her curious head around from behind a chair. "Rose, come meet your new brother." Marie Cosette's face was streaked with tears. "Look at all of his hair," she murmured fondly, tenderly kissing her little son, who was snorting and grunting softly as he adjusted to his new surroundings. Rose crawled onto the bed and cuddled up beside her mother. She peered at the baby inquisitively for a moment, then blurted, "Why does he look so funny?" His sweet face was still slightly swollen, and he still bore some of the white streaks of childbirth. Manon's eyes narrowed as she gently smacked the back of Rose's head. "Don't speak about your brother that way." Then she wetted the corner of a towel and continued to carefully clean the little babe's exposed fingers. Marie Cosette pulled her daughter close. "Don't worry, Angel," she said, softly cuddling her daughter's brow. "Babies just need a few days." Nui sighed. "I suppose we should tell the master?" The three women looked at each other for a moment, an uncomfortable silence settling into the room, until Marie Cosette firmly stated, "Yes, tell my husband that his son and heir has arrived." She turned to Manon. "Could you help me?" She handed the baby to Manon, and, despite her enervation, began to attend her hair and face. "Wrap him in velvet for his father. Perhaps use the pillowcase. Rose, please go get your uncle. Slowly." As Marie Cosette watched her newborn son in Manon's arms, a surge of emotion washed over her. She was relieved. She had borne a boy. That was important. But she was also worried. This world had only ever tried to harm her, and she expected no less for her innocent little son. And even more frightening was the fact that, in this moment, she was at peace. and for Marie Suzette nothing was more terrifying. "You must be so proud," Manon said kindly as she handed the baby back to Marie Suzette. "I am not proud, but I am happy, and happiness blinds, I think, more than pride," she whispered as she wove her fingers through her infant's curls. With a thud, the bedroom door opened and Antoine entered the room. He locked his gaze on his wife and child. He tried to move towards them, but his feet suddenly felt as if they were anchored to the spot, bound by invisible chains too ponderous to move a single step. He stood awkward and motionless, his breath caught as he took in the sight before him. Marie Suzette handed the now sleeping newborn to Nuit. She grabbed the poster of the bed and tried to rise for her husband. "Your son, my lord," she announced proudly, gesturing to the baby swaddled in green velvet. The room fell silent. Not even the baby made a sound. Then, as if a dam had burst, releasing all the stress he had been holding inside, Antoine found his voice. "No, my love, rest. Don't get up for me," he said warmly. But he still couldn't manage to move. At least he was breathing now. Until truly seeing him, his own child, Antoine hadn't fully grasped how overwhelming a feeling that would be. He had been around children before, but this was the first time that he, Antoine David de la Pailletterie, had one of his own. The emotions were different from anything he had ever experienced, as exhilarating as they were daunting. From behind him, Rose piped up, her excited voice practically squeaking, "Aren't you going to hold him?" The room filled with laughter. The tension, the worry, it had all been so foolish. This was a moment of joy. It was rare, precious, and mutual. For one ephemeral moment, they were all equal. They were all living that beauty together. Antoine leaned down and kissed Rose on the head. A wide smile spread across his face. Rose looked up at her stepfather in surprise. He had rarely shown her such affection before. Overcome with glee, she quickly grabbed his leg and hugged him tightly. "I don't think she's ever going to let you go," Nuit smirked. They all laughed. It was enough to cause the little girl to pause. She released his leg and gave a quick curtsy, her face flushed with embarrassment. "It's all right, Rose," Antoine smiled. Nuit stepped forward, cradling the baby carefully. "Here you are, master, your little Marquis." Antoine held his arms out awkwardly. As Nuit laid the baby in his arms, the infant let out a loud cry. "He is so fragile and small," Antoine said nervously. "He is strong," Nuit interjected firmly, her eyes boldly meeting Antoine's. "Ligen fos nan krili." He has strength in his cry. Antoine looked down at his son, who had begun to squirm. Antoine suddenly felt very panicked. He had never held a baby before. "Arm under the head, sir," Nuit instructed kindly. Antoine glanced worriedly at Nuit. "I need a moment. Let me sit." He didn't feel comfortable walking with a baby in his arm, so he handed him back to Nuit as he settled onto the edge of the bed next to his wife. Marie Suzette held her breath and watched him closely. As Nuit readjusted the baby into his arms, Marie Suzette turned to her husband. "You did it, my lord." Antoine chuckled. "No," he said. "You did, darling." He scooted closer to her. He knew she was always a little apprehensive around men, even him. He knew on some level that it was a justifiable reaction. She had endured unspeakable traumas. But at this moment, he didn't care how skittish she was. Every bone in his body yearned to hold them both tightly. He brushed back her hair gently and smiled at her. Eased by his gentle baritone and exhausted from the day, Marie Suzette exhaled and rested her head carefully on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close against him, cradling his baby and wife. "Thomas Alexandre," Antoine puffed proudly. gazing down at the infant in his arms. "A strong name, sir," Nui said. "He will surely do incredible things." Antoine looked down peacefully at his son. He bent his head down and whispered softly into the child's ear. "I promise I will always protect you. As the Lord our God is my witness, I will keep you safe." He traced the sign of the cross over his son's forehead and turned to his wife. "You have never looked more radiant." He leaned over and kissed Marie Sosette passionately. She was as beautiful in this moment as the first time he laid eyes on her. Her heart fluttered as he squeezed her tightly. "Did you mean what you said to him?" she asked quietly. "Every word." She smiled. The thing she yearned for more than anything else in the world was the assurance that she and her children would always be safe. As she rested her weary head on his shoulder, she genuinely believed that he meant his promise. Rose climbed back onto the bed, stumbling a bit as she tried to crawl over her mother to get a better look at the sleeping baby. Often, we pass beside happiness without seeing it, without looking at it, or even if we have seen and looked at it, without recognizing it. This day was an exception. Outside the window, the crack of a whip was heard as the wind carried the torturous sound into the sanctuary of the bedroom. Nui and Manon shivered and looked over to Marie Sosette. But their mistress had succumbed to her exhaustion.